now you will be ballistic.
No, just truthful, that's all.
Okay, please come take your seats.
And I'm the last. I'm the last.
You're last. So I'd just like to make a quick announcement that there's a pair of glasses that were found up front here. Are these your glasses?
Maybe Sandrine.
Okay, so let's just get started, and people will continue to come in. Are these yours?
No,
Yeah. Stay here because I want to introduce you maybe at the end of the session, or maybe right now. Okay. Yeah. Get her. Okay. As we're getting started, since this session is on values for the Anthropocene and new ways of thinking, I think it's important to acknowledge that the Club of Rome has a historic chapter beginning. And that in the last couple of days, our two new co-presidents have been elected. And they are Sandrine and Manfela. Right away, paparazzi. Okay. You know, it feels like there's this obvious problem that humanity is on a suicide mission. That there's a combination of economics, of culture, of education, of business, of academia, and that somehow we can't seem to get off of this tract that is leading us into obvious peril. 50 years. We've been talking about this. And the impression is that if we could just give enough information, if we could just say it right, if we could just provide the perfect communication of how dire this situation is, that it would become perfectly obvious, and it would be logical, and it would be practical, and it would be possible that we could change course. And yet somehow there is this perpetuation of these continued patterns, continued momentums, with incremental change, with new vocabulary, with additional science, but still, here we are. And ultimately, there becomes a question of what is what are those connective processes in the system? What is the context and the multiple contexts that are together providing this stuckness? And people will say, well, what we have to do is we have to change governance. But what we really have to do is we have to change the economy. What we really have to do is we have to change the way we think. What we really have to do is we have to change from the inside. But we can't change from the inside when the world around us is still moving in the way that it's moving. My father, Gregory Bateson, talked about a theory that he described. It was a theory that it described a relational pattern called a double bind. And in the double bind, what happens is that it's a little like a catch-22. And if you do this thing, you're in big trouble. And if you do that thing, you're in big trouble. And if you do nothing, you're in big trouble. And the hitch with a double bind is that very often you can't say, excuse me, but this is a double bind. Let me give you an example. I'll give you the double bind light that will probably resonate with you. Is that moment, you know, when you're with your partner and they say, you never tell me that you love me. Been there? On either side of that? And of course it's a trap, right? Because if you then say, oh, but I do love you, clearly you're not sincere. It doesn't count. But if you don't say, then clearly they were right. And to make this a little more serious, in order to continue to survive, we must make changes. But in order to continue to survive, we must not make changes. In order to get to next week, I need to drive my car, I need to work, I need to buy groceries, I need to feed my children. There is a continuance there. But all of those processes are built into systems that are inherently suicidal. And so I should not continue them. This is a double bind. I think that this theory is useful to bring up in this circumstance because it gives us not necessarily a solution, but a familiarity and a way of talking about a blind spot and a trap. And I think in this session, it's important that we start to think about what are the blind spots. Where have our entrained processes of perception, not just language, not just visuals, but cultural, economic perception, where have those entrained forms of perception left us blind? Instead of pointing fingers and blaming right away, there's some blame out there. You know, you never tell me that you love me. No. Yeah, but he's just saying that. I love you too. So, but seriously, where are the blind spots? And how can we begin to open those blind spots up? And you know, the consequences of opening blind spots are that things become disorienting, confusing, upsetting. It's easy to be lost. All right, when new forms of perception are coming in, they're kind of unrecognizable. Where am I? What's happening here? Where did this come from? I didn't see this. And that discomfort, I think, is important. So, as an invitation to that discomfort, I would like to introduce you to my new friend, Chandran Nair. Go ahead, Chandran. And in this session, everyone's under strict orders for no more than 10 minutes so we have conversation, because I promised you that, and I love you too.
Okay. Buongiorno. Can you hear
microphone?
me? Microphone. there is one.
Hello? Yeah, okay. Buongiorno. Is that good enough Italian-wise? Okay. Good morning, that's pretty good. Guten Morgen, konnichiwa, hi, and namaste to my Indian friends, and assalamu alaikum. Does that freak you out? No. Okay. All right. For the last 2 days, I've been feeling rather small, actually. Feeling like I come from nowhere. I wanted to call my parents, but they're both dead, because they told me I came from a large civilization that had history, values. But I heard nothing of that here. So I've been feeling rather small. And so I'd like to just, because this is about mindsets, values, and blind spots, try to trigger the thoughts, particularly in Europe. I mean, the United States is a lost cause, so I don't go there. But at least in Europe, with talk of Renaissance and Enlightenment, perhaps get you to understand there's a world outside your world. It's actually the dominant world. It's the most amount of people. They have a history. It may not be called the Enlightenment or the Renaissance, but the world was not dark when you had your Enlightenment and your Renaissance. It was not. I'll just give you one example. As far as I understand it, the Enlightenment period was sort of the 18th century, am I right? Somewhere 1750. We Asian guys, we know your history. And then there's the Renaissance, which I believe was somewhere between the 14th and the 17th century. One of the greatest pieces of architecture in the world was actually built in 1632 in India. How many of you know which one I'm talking about? The Taj Mahal. So it's not like everything was happening in Europe. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I mean, nothing good was happening in the new world called the United States today because it kind of didn't exist. But not everything good was happening here. I just think this is really important to understand. I can take you to a temple in India called the Mahalakshmi Temple in Madurai. Anyone been there? Yeah, it'll put anything in Europe in the context, if you want to know. And then there's the Angkor Wat, which goes back to the 12th century. So there's a problem that everything and our mindsets and our values are shaped by our reference points, yes? So being a subject of the colonial period, my mindset was completely dominated by a Western mindset, which was the British mindset, which was told me that literature was essentially limited to Shakespeare. Dance forms was ballet. There was nothing else. So it's very important to understand. And in the last 2 days, all I've seen is references to essentially a European context. This is very limiting. You have to start looking at the world differently and not be so worried that the Chinese are becoming a bit richer. They're coming, and it's their time, and it's fair. And wait till the Indians come. And if you think the Chinese don't have your European sensibilities, wait for the Indians. And they speak English too, which is double trouble. Now, so, and unfortunately, many of them work in business schools. Those are the elites, but wait. So you have to see the world differently. Every reference almost, every time I come to Europe, to China, is negative. Get real. Either you're all, I don't want to use the word, but either you have such biases inbuilt that you can't see the right of the majority to rise, or you have some deeply troubling views about how the world should be. 3 weeks ago, I was in Europe in a closed-door session of 300-400 people, and there was a session that I was talking about the post-Western world. So the post-Western world, as far as the Western intellectuals are concerned, is some narrative about it will be bad. Because my God, those Africans, Indians, and all of those come in, and they don't understand rules. They're not that civilized, etc. So I just said, post-Western world, and they didn't know that I was going to be trouble. So I just said, surely, how many of you think that the post-Western world is a fairer world? And no hands went up because it was like a curveball question. They thought I was going to be that subservient guy from Asia who was going to play to the narrative. the values that you all enshrine. Well, I actually come up from a very different background. I think a post-Western world, I can't wait for this. Not because I don't like you all, but because I believe in fairness. And a fair world is one in which 15% of the world don't tell me what is right or wrong. A fair world is one in which 85% may say, hey, actually, there's a different way. And by the way, we have 10,000 years of civilization. I didn't just arrive yesterday. And maybe we know something. And maybe it's not a view that democracy is not sacrosanct. So I'm playing with your heads. Okay, now, so my point is we have to have very different worldviews, and you have to be accepting of this. Now, so a couple of things that I want to pick on, and then my time's probably going to run out. So the Club of Rome has something called the world is full. It was empty, meaning smaller populations, 1 billion about 200 years ago. Today, 7.5, maybe peaking at about 10 billion. We heard all of that. The problem is the world, the majority are unfulfilled. It's not like it's full of equal people. It's not. The problem is those who are full want to say it's full, but they don't want to acknowledge that it's not full of equal people. In fact, the majority, about 60%, you could make it 70 depending on your thresholds of what full fulfillment looks like, do not have the basics. Therein lies the problem that we all talk about. We talk about the world as though it's all made up of people like us, privileged, that includes me, who have most of our basic needs catered for, and somehow now we need to do something. But the problem is, for those who don't have, who are the majority, they want to take something from us. And we have to give things up because we have too much. Now, so the unfulfilled don't have the basics. I'll give you one example, for instance. So India has a population of 1.3 billion, peaking at 1.5. Beware, there's going to be a lot of Indians. Okay? Now, there's going to be a lot of Indians. The majority of Indians don't have access to the basic needs. They don't have housing, electricity, water, sanitation, most of it. Now, they have a right to it. And just talking about materials, if most Indians have a basic home, and I'm not talking, you know, high-rise condominiums like the ones we have in Hong Kong, Singapore, those are all Disneylands. I mean, we're just talking basic. The material balance of the world will be turned upside down. Right? But do they have a right to this? Yes. Now add to the 700, 800 million Indians who don't have that, 3 billion others. They have a right. So the problem with the so-called definition of sustainable development, achieving all of these goals, is that how do we develop by providing people with those basic rights? I call it food, shelter, basic energy supply, healthcare, etc., without essentially upturning all the things that we privileged people think the world should find a balance. So my consensus is very simply this. It's going to be messy. Get used to it. It's going to be very messy, and great scientists are doing all sorts of things. But we have to understand the majority don't have, and they now want. Now, why does that matter in the context of history? The problem is that those of us in the developing world have aped economic models, development models, and narratives that have essentially been enshrined through the Western narrative. I will argue that if we go down that route, then it can only be catastrophe. So we have to reject that. This becomes very difficult because then there is something called values, which is code for Western values, which apparently must be spread universally throughout the world. You know, remember Iraq, Syria. All of those things need to be spread. But of course, some of them, some countries are strong enough to resist. It's called like China, so they hate them because they are resisting that. But these countries and Indonesia, they all will need those basic needs. This will upturn everything we know about how the world will look like. So climate change, and there are people here who are much more familiar, will essentially create huge distortions in the way the privileged live. There will be a war on who can have what. So I want to end by saying that narratives matter, but the narrative in the West is simply, very often, no sacrifice. Therefore, the option is technology. Let's work with investment bankers. I mean, that's like an oxymoron. And then let's work with companies. Well, companies, and I work with a lot of companies, but companies are not in the business of doing good. That doesn't make them evil. Companies are in the business of providing goods and services by essentially making you buy things you don't need with money you don't have. You know that? It's called debt. Or even better, if you're a bit rich, getting you to buy things you don't need with money you don't have to impress people you don't like, which is the kind of neighbors and people like that. Now, so companies don't do that. It doesn't make them bad. The only institutions that can protect us are the institutions of the state. So I'll finish by saying that in the Western world, rules apparently are not good. My view is, in the large developing countries of the world, we need draconian rules. Draconian rules that infringe on your definitions of rights and freedoms. Because it's the only way we will be able to essentially collectively coexist. So I'll finish by saying, for instance, why you don't have rules. We had the mayor of Rome, was it yesterday? Lovely. She could do one thing. But the democratic systems will not allow that. She could say, for instance, Rome, the holy city, will ban plastic bottles. But democracies don't allow for this. Ban plastic bottles and get the Pope to sign on. And then all these pious people who come to queue up to pray cannot enter the inter sanctum if they have any plastic on them. Now, there's an Indian temple, and many in India, where you cannot enter with anything but your clothes. Now, praying is serious business. I don't pray too much, but, on the occasion I do. Then it sends a message. But in my argument is Western democracies can't do this. Because the individual is king. Freedom should never be unfettered. And my God, even in the face of existential threats, and we heard all about this, democracy is so important. So the world is going down the toilet, but we will preserve our democracy. So I'll finish by saying, liberalism, as framed by the West, is often an excuse to essentially hide behind the need to preserve privileges. Those privileges cannot be preserved. And I would argue, therefore, in terms of mindsets and values, we have to question a couple of things. The individual is not king. Freedom is not unfettered. Collective interests should override individual rights. Democracy is not the panacea for the challenges we have. And finally, economic models that essentially continue to tinker at the edges need to be completely questioned because they are based on values that are essentially the heart of the Western mindset. And that's what we have to change. And I call for very strong states in the developing countries, very strong draconian rules to preserve the rights of the collective and not just enhance the rights of the individuals. Thank you.
Thank you, Chandran. The way in which our institutions and culture have come together to form the justification for the levels of exploitation and extraction that have taken place and that continue to take place it should give us pause. What is that at the core that allows for that exploitation and extraction to continue? I'm not asking you to answer. I'm just bridging into our next speaker. So Ernst, please continue.
Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you, Chandran, for this wonderful introduction. Let me link what you say with what Anders has said in our General Assembly and here, the need for a climate emergency initiative. Today, 90 out of 100 new coal power plants are built in the south, necessarily so, because you are simply right. However, if that continues, we have lost the game about stabilizing climate. One concept has been developed for the climate conference in Copenhagen 2009 by a German council for the Chancellor, the so-called budget approach, which says all countries, in proportion to their current population, have the same right using the atmosphere. But the old industrialized countries have essentially already used up, exhausted their rights. If they want to do additional burning oil on the road or electricity from coal or so, they would have to go shopping to developing countries, buying permits. And that would lead to a situation in the north dramatically accelerating decarbonization, and for the first time in history, lead to a situation in the south where you get richer by not building the next coal power plant, but rather by accelerating the transition to efficiency and renewables and selling some of the free permits to the north. That would make us hopeful that the emergency initiative will be successful. Now, my point is essentially talking about the Anthropocene and the quest for a new enlightenment, and indeed referring to the empty world and the full world. I mean, the distinction was essentially formulated by Professor Herman Daly once with the World Bank, and it is very clear. In the empty world, economics is totally different from what it has to be in the full world. And he is giving the example of fishery. If you want more fish in the empty world, you simply have to have more fishermen, more boats, more nets, etc. You have more fish. But in the full world, the first thing you have to do is protection zones for fish against fishery. And this is a different kind of economy. We have to understand that most of our notions of reality, of resources, of instincts of humans, etc., stem from the empty world and have to be fundamentally modified. So, all religions, all our instincts, our languages, the European Enlightenment, you refer to it, economy of mining, population increase, adoration of growth, in short, the present system stem from the empty world. You will appreciate that the concepts of that world are no longer valid. So this is the book which we produced, 35 members of the Club of Rome, in a wonderful joint effort. And I was very happy from Yiheng to learn that the Chinese version is now out, and it is meant to emphasize that difference and try to formulate what is needed in the full world. Now, I was very happy to see that now, from now on, Come On is on the social media. And smartphone owners in the room are encouraged to take a picture here and communicate and make it an avalanche of information into your friends, etc., so that Come On can find readers outside the room. Now, Come On has 3 chapters. don't tell me the current trends are sustainable. Come on. Come on. Don't stick to outdated philosophies. And then, come on, join us on an exciting journey towards a sustainable world. So it's these three very different parts that make the entire. But now I'm only talking about outdated philosophies and what can be done about. Now, let me give you an example. Of course, we were very happy having the Paris Agreement on climate. But then the climate diplomats come back to their capitals and talk about the need to do something about climate. And what are politicians saying in reaction? It's always the same, in the south and the north. Well, yes, we have to do more for climate, but it's going to be extraordinarily expensive, so we need a lot more growth. This is the unanimous reply in all countries, which is crap. But it's the rule, not the exception. So, is that the right answer? No, it's not. You know, here are 8 different sectors of the economy, all showing a strict correlation between growth and carbon dioxide emissions. So, we seem to be reasonably good doctors in diagnosing the disease. It's the climate instability. But we are completely idiotic therapists. The recipe for fighting the disease makes the disease worse. Would you go to such doctors? No. But this is we. We are the wrong doctors. So, we better change. A great encouragement for us in writing the Club of Rome, Come On, was the encyclical Laudato Si by the Pope here next door. And evidently, greed, selfishness, brutal competition, purely utilitarian economics destroy the common home, leaving nothing for grandchildren, etc. And then we found out that most of the heroes of today's economics are systematically wrong quoted. And we went through 3 of them. We could have Adam Smith, David Ricardo, and Charles Darwin. For Adam Smith, it was clear that the geographical reach of the market and the geographical reach of the law were identical. But today, markets are global and the law remains mostly national. So you can't guess who is winning. The markets are winning over the lawmakers, making what you say about drastic measures to be taken by the state impossible almost. So we have to learn that. And for David Ricardo, capital had to stay where it was sitting. And today, capital is by far the most mobile production factor. I mean, David Ricardo would turn around in his grave if he was seeing that today's internationalist capitalism is using Ricardo for justification. It's crazy. Or for Charles Darwin, competition, of course, was a fact, but it's mostly a local affair. Geographical borders were helpful for evolution, which is more or less the opposite of what economists say today. And he found the finches, now called Darwin finches, that evolved in the absence of competition from birds from the South American companies. Of course, economists always want to maximize competition. Before going on that, I was speaking with Connie Hedegaard yesterday, and she gave me a wonderful hint of a Danish journalist, Jørgen Steen Nielsen of the daily newspaper Information, who has looked more or less into all, not only 3, all sort of heroes of the past and how they are misquoted. And I said, we at the Club of Rome want to have that published not only in Danish, which is fine, but also in English and other languages. I know. And then an important part is, of course, the stupid reductionist kind of philosophy that is prevalent, particularly in the Anglo-Saxon world, and it is against the new mindset that we need. Yesterday I had a good talk with Thomas Björkman, who talked with me about the new mindset from separation to connectedness, from things to systems and processes, from rational to evolving, etc. So this kind of transition is what we absolutely need, and the Club of Rome is working on it. And responding to the philosophical crisis, we suggest to engage in a new enlightenment. And no, I'm not going into details any longer. The time is running off. And what today in America is popular by people like Steven Pinker is enlightenment now. But this is essentially returning to the old enlightenment. That's not good enough. It may be a good answer to Trump and his lying, but we go a lot deeper and think that balance could become a key notion for the new enlightenment between humans and nature, short-term and long-term, public and private, religion and state, feminine and masculine, equity and rewards for achievement. Both are needed. Always balance is what we need, and speed and stability. You know, an economics in which always the speediest is winning is totally destructive for our civilization. And in the Asian countries, there is a clear understanding of the need for balance, while in the West we still have dominant dogmatism, and this is not good enough. Thank you very much.
The next input will come from Tomoyo Nonaka. And while Tomoyo's getting set up, I just want to add, because I know that it's bubbling in the room, that the word enlightenment triggers different connotations for different people. And that this is actually an important moment of recognition around some of what Chandran was saying around these things you think you know that you're familiar with, the words you think you know what they mean, they may not mean what you think they mean. This pattern you see, it may not be what you think it is. The blind spots lead us to the question of really what is real. And I don't mean to get cheeky and overly philosophical with this openness, but it's a serious question. The world that we're living in is comprised of constructs that we live in. If those constructs are deadly, it's in our best interest to change them. And yet somehow they become very real. Are they real? And now, Tomoyo.
Okay, thank you, Nora. It's so hot, isn't it? Right? Ta-da! Okay. Okay, feel better. I like this. And Anthropocene, I'd like to use that word Gaia. Could I? Thank you, because I'm a representative of the Gaia initiative in Japan. And let me answer to you, Nora. You know, you said that this situation, and it's... By having this. This is our home, and we come from here, and still we are on top. Not top. We are living, make living. But the situation is like that, right? It's very obvious. Not only air, water, but our heart is also so damaged and ruined. And I'm sure that today I'm not, I don't have to explain about what is Gaia, right? So make it short. The Gaia is recognized this planet of Earth as a living organism. It means we are connected to each other. Every tiny little piece are connected to each other. Do you feel that way? Good, very good. Fortunate or unfortunate or not, but you are beside, you're sitting, and the next person, we are family. Do you know what? Because Ernst is taking note, not taking a note, is preparing what you are going to speak. I mean the Anders. Look, he doesn't listen to me.
I listen all the time and I take notes.
Okay. His deep sigh is coming into my body and energize me. You know, through this breathing, we are family. So it's this area is yours and this part is mine. No. We are on the same canoe. In the 60s and 70s, Buckminster Fuller called this, named this planet, the spaceship named Earth, right? We are on the same canoe. Means we have, as we've learned so much yesterday, we have a very complex system. System means system needs to have rule, certain rule, right? Then the stronger, the power side is making rule to sustain their own position, right? So let's open our eyes. What is our rule? The real word, rule, is homeostasis, and owing to it, we can be survive. We can be alive, right? It's a rule of universe, rule of cosmos, right? Who is providing this planet of Earth, this spaceship, energy? Right, from the oxygen and but so high speed, they're moving by herself and also making a circle. No plague, right? It's a rule. So we should open our eyes where we come from and where we to go. Then let's see, what is, for example, the situation, mass situation, who made this? What is the main cause? So many. This is also so many causes. But mainly, the name business. Don't you agree? The action or moral or whatever, the mainly. Then, let me focus on that. What is a rule of the business? Make it simple. Oh, sorry. Do me a favor. Because I start my career as a TV anchor woman, as a journalist. So this is my motto. I'm supposed to have two eyes. Yes, of course, two eyes. But bird's eye and ant's eye. You know, micro and macro eyes. The wide angle lens at the same time when we see the material or event or whatever. And in other words, make it simple. Complex and simple together. Okay. Then, the business world, the situation. For example, the numbers. Men and women, the ratio is naturally just not but kind of balanced, you know. But look into the business scene. Business scene is like that. Well, right after the industrialization, or make it simple, right after World War II was over, then at certain timing. They know and we know. It's not good balance. We need more female than less support. It is good. It is better compared with doing nothing. But the number, hypothetically, the present situation is far, far, far from this balance. But look, I don't think so. I'm so glad that, yes, Ernst make yin and yang. But the most important part is this small, this small dot. You know, the male side, female side. The center of the gravity, it's supposed, the center of the point is the value of just opposite side, the literacy or empathy or understanding and the opposite side of the value. Okay, this is a very important point. And let me, okay. Nora said that I'm supposed to finish it. So maybe the next round I can tell. But this is the situation right now as well. As Chandra mentioned, this is a demographic pie chart. Let's suppose that looking at the clock, this 10 to 12 is developed countries. BRICS sounds too old, but this, the majority. So shift the value. From here to help them, no. They are living in certain situation of since long time ago. We are supposed to learn from them how to live the sustainable human life. So it's the time to shift, for learning. And I have many other things, if I'm allowed to speak later. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Tomoyo. And Anders Wikman, please give us your input, and then we'll open to conversation.
Well, as a matter of fact, thank you. I had prepared a few slides, but I leave them. And I think the best I can do is to try to respond to and build on what the other speakers have said. In particular, Chandran's opening, which I think was very, very strong, provoking, but it deserves, of course, to be commented upon. Ernst has already alluded to Come On and our attempt in that book to really, on the one hand, critique the present system and situation, exploitation of man and nature, and in particular also the reductionistic way we are approaching almost every problem, and making a plea for a better balance. But really, chapter 2 is really trying to initiate a debate about what kind of values and principles have to underpin future development. Of course, Chandran, we have problems of the kind that you described, primarily between the North and the South, or the Western world and the South. Also inside the Western world. Piketty's book a couple of years ago showed that a more equal distribution of wealth and income, which did happen between 1930s and late 1970s, seems to be an exception. And the role of capital accumulation and the principles of shareholder value, etc., ultimately leads to a widening of gaps also in our part of the world. And we are trying to address that in Come On. You put your finger in particular on access to resources. And what you said if every Indian had a modest house, the consequences in terms of materials and energy would be disastrous. By the way, we have made studies on that under Ernst's leadership in the International Resource Panel. I think I alluded to it yesterday or the day before yesterday. Only the infrastructure that is needed in the south till 2050 and the greenhouse gases generated during that process, primarily from steel and cement, would more or less eat up the so-called allowed carbon budget for 2 degrees, not to speak of 1.5. At the same time, and by the way, the Club of Rome pointed at this problem 50 years ago, and in all the updates, that's been one of the underlying comments. I think one of the problems we've had is that neoclassical economics, and particularly neoliberal economics, have told us that there is a trickle-down effect, and sooner or later everybody will be happy and well off. And we see now that that's not working. But that has sort of, if not mesmerized, at least led to us avoiding this necessary debate. And the short-termism of the economy has contributed to it. I believe, and I think many studies have shown that in many areas, in terms of materials and energy, there are solutions within reach. The problem is, how do we implement them, and how do we implement them in the South? And it will require capacity and competences, but it will also require financial resources. I read an article the other day that Britain, there was an estimate by 2 scientists, that the plundering of Britain, of India between 1760 and 1947 was estimated at 10 trillion British pounds. I don't know in which currency, whether it was today's currency. It must have been today's currency. So, I mean, there is a huge historical responsibility here, not only between Britain and India. And it's amazing we don't talk about it more. I agree with you. But let's assume that we would decide to redistribute not 0.0%, 0.7% from developed to developing countries, or industrialized countries to developing countries, and most of them don't live up to it. But let's assume we went from 0.7 to 3 or 4 or 5%, which I think would be what would be required to do what is needed. My question is, how do we organize it? I had a friend who worked for the Ford Foundation many years, a Swede, Göran Hayden. He wrote a book 20 years ago about this particular problem. And he said, based on his experience and the inefficiency in the system to really distribute money the right way, he said, why not establish independent foundations in each and every region, composed of people from business, people from NGOs, people from science, widely composed, and let them be responsible, and let them receive proposals on how to spend the money. I don't know. I think that he was onto something quite interesting, because simply continue the kind of development cooperation that we have had in the past, I don't think would do the trick, because there is too much corruption on many levels and many fronts. So I think we have to, if we accept more or less your analysis, we would really have to come up with some very, very both efficient and just mechanisms for how to do that. Last but not the least, you challenge our values of democracy, freedom, etc. And I hear you. And some of us have more or less concluded how difficult it is to implement climate policies in our own countries, in democracies, because people in the short term don't want the necessary things to happen. So I accept your critique of this individualism. At the same time, based on what we have lived past during the 20th century, whether we talk about Nazism and fascism or communism, I don't think anyone would throw these values overboard. The challenge is to improve and make democracy work better. And I agree with you, a better balance between the individual and the public interest and public good. That's, for me, the only way forward. And whether we call that a reformed Western mindset or something else, I don't mind, but I wouldn't throw it overboard. And who knows who will succeed President Xi. And by the way, some of his human rights-related policies, to me, are very, very problematic. Thank you.
I think that, Chandran, you should probably respond to that. And then I'd like to open to questions from the floor.
Okay, thanks so much, Anders, for that cut things. Just a couple of things here. I think we have to come to the conclusion that the development model premise that the rich world will help the poor world is a lie. This is not going to happen. So let's abolish this from our mindsets. This idea somehow that benevolent people in the rich world will help will not happen. Secondly, after all, as far as I understand it, the rich world is getting poorer. So how will this work? The other point I want to try and make about democracy and freedom, and maybe I'm being a bit outlandish here, I would say China is more democratic than India. Now, for most of you, this will come as a shock. But if you understand the system, you will understand what is governance for? Is to create outcomes that are better. Chinese system, and I'm not saying it's perfect, and I understand, but you know, human rights seems to be the only thing that people in Europe think about in terms of freedom of speech, etc. And I value those things too. But China has delivered more human rights than India has in its entire post-independence era, in terms of uplifting 500 million people. I would argue that China has uplifted more people than any nation in human history out of poverty. And that's probably the most important human right. That's the most important human right. Of course, in liberal societies, freedom of speech and all of that's nice, but you know, in my world, it ranks like number 7 or 8. So my point is simply this. The Club of Rome does present solutions on resources, etc. But the problem you referred to, Anders, it did not go to that difficult place, which is what are my rights and freedoms? Because in the Western narrative, you can't question it. So I'll give you one example. I don't think car ownership is a human right. Now, when I go to the United States and say this, they think I'm undercover Taliban. Even though I shaved my beard and left the turban. Or they think I must be a card-carrying member of the Chinese Communist Party living in Hong Kong. But car ownership is not a human right. The only way to stop the disaster of the automotive industry is rules. Now the European Union is trying to take that action through strong action. That reinforces my belief. Only the state can act. Do not believe private companies do this. They are not criminals, but they don't. So the Club of Rome has not gone where it needs to go in the 21st century, which is a full world of lots of unfulfilled people. They cannot have the same things at the same time. So there are going to be constraints. Constraints start to immediately impact on so-called perceived notions of rights and freedoms. So the last thing I'd like to just, open this up. You use terms of reference like Nazism and communism. Those are not my terms of reference. I didn't live with the Nazis, nor did I create them. They are your terms of reference. They're not mine. So the terms of reference are constantly the European experience. What happened to us mustn't happen to those people. Well, those people may have their own destiny in their own hands. So to just tickle this a bit more, if you're poor today, would you rather be Chinese or Indian? I know the answer. And looking like me, I can say Chinese. What is the Achilles heel of the Indian system? Democracy. Slight problem. But that's the conversation we need to have, rather than pretend that democracy, because it has worked in the West, is the panacea for the world. And let me also say that democracy in the West was championed and celebrated so much, while the rest of us were oppressed under democratic systems. The UK was a democracy while it oppressed hundreds of millions of Indians, robbed and pillaged. Democracy, and I think Francis Macron was the first to acknowledge in Europe that its wealth has been built on the brutalization of civilizations in North Africa. That was how, so when you're wealthy, you can have the privilege, but in a crowded world, in a full world, all of us can't be free. We have to be restrained. And those restraints come to the institutions of society. And I'll finish by saying, I don't think these ideas will come from the West. It's too uncomfortable. My point is to try and take this narrative to the parts of the world where we have to confront this reality and figure out what is freedom and rights. What can we have and can't we have? That's a very difficult conversation. These ideas will not come from Harvard Business School or anywhere else. It has to come from the laboratory of that interface, that challenge, that front line. It's not in Europe. It's elsewhere. So that's my response to that. Thank you.
Okay, we're going to take some questions from the floor.
I have a comment and then a question. And Chandra, I love you. So we don't hate you in the United States. We love you. Okay. I think the whole narrative has talked about resource uses in such a way that they've forgotten the regenerative ability to make more food, to make more forests, to make more clean water, to make more regenerative resources in many ways. And I think this is one of the important things that can and should happen in large areas like China and India, where they have used up some very important things like clean water and sea fisheries and things. And this is a technology that I believe could be passed and very much utilized with employment there and a great deal more protein or clean water or health. And we have a president who's into healing, and I think that might be the concept, healing those damaged parts of the earth instead of those nice lines which we've become used to in all the models. I think regenerative healing might be the phrase. So there are several of yours who might want to talk to that. Or do you want more questions?
Yeah, let's take a few questions and then we'll, yeah.
I also want to respond to Chandra's fascinating presentation, and I've spent quite a bit of time studying what's happening in China and what's happening with China. I remember a book by Lester Brown some years ago, I think 1995, called Who is Going to Feed China? ? And today the question is not who is going to feed China, but who is feeding China. And one really fascinating development, but also a worrying development, is that China, as a result of its growth in affluence and getting, as you said, 500 million people out of poverty, is now in itself in the process of colonializing territories as elsewhere in the world, particularly in places like the Amazon, in Mato Grosso, where some of the largest fields are for producing soya beans, in Argentina, and in parts of Africa and so on. So China wants more meat, which is perfectly understandable given that that's the connection to affluence. But by and large, I think what is now really the greatest challenge in the world, actually, I think, is can that concept of ecological civilization that is also being developed in China come to fruition to an extent that the model of China is not going to be copied by other countries in terms of ever greater impacts of developing countries that have become richer but are now in their own way affecting other countries in other parts of the world and ultimately reducing their capacity to develop, particularly when it comes to territories for supplying food. Of course, there's also the colonialization of space in terms of carbon emissions and so on. That also comes out of the development of, of industrial civilization and urbanizing world in China. Thank you.
Thank you. I know there's a lot of questions and things to come in. We have one here and then one there.
I'm stunned. I mean, this is the most ridiculous statement I have ever heard voiced in a Club of Rome meeting. After this very wise comment by Chandran, basically saying that the world is full, there is 80% of the population that has not gotten to the table. And then you start by answering that they are now starting to take some of the colonization territory that has made us rich, and argue that, give this as an answer to the very legitimate request that, the world is for all, and if there is to be a certain element of fairness here, what you should have said is that we should reduce our footprint and release that footprint for the use of the poor of the world. Sorry for, I'm really shocked. The comment I had planned to make is the following. Please notice that in the report to the Club of Rome that we presented yesterday, the Anders Rockström report, we have fought for half a year to agree on what are the 4 transitional moves that needs to be undertaken. And the story about the fight to get as number 3 the use of Chinese development models rather than the Washington Consensus in order to raise the level of affluence in the poor world, it ended up on the 3rd place. Thank you, due to a lot of fighting. Because the response, again, among most of the people that contributed to this discussion was that regenerative agriculture is, of course, a safe haven. This we can talk about without offending anyone, without facing the real challenge, which is the one that Chandran is voicing. We also, unbelievably, managed to include as the 4th recommendation the continued effort to reduce the number of children in the world. We have phrased it now finally in a way which is less offensive than the way I have used for the last 20 years. We're basically saying we're calling for more education of women, more maternal health, all the things that make the women of the world willing on an individual basis, to choose to have fewer children. Of course, the Chinese have shown responsibility in trying to feed themselves by passing the Draculian, rule that only 1 child is acceptable, and it worked. They are 500 million or 400 million people fewer. Their food production has 4-doubled over the last 40 years, so they are largely feeding themselves. The Chinese are terribly worried about the fact that they need, for a 20-year period, to import calories from the rest of the world. They're doing what they can to stop that, of course.
And then there was right next to you, Jürgen.
I just want to tell you a story that you already know. I'm sorry. When the crisis in Greece took place, the members of the European Union decided to help Greece, and they were putting money into Greece to develop Greece, to solve the problem in Greece. But they did not solve the problem in Greece. They solved the problem of big banks that had lent money to Greece. And what I want to tell you with this story is the following. Anders was speaking about principles of capital accumulation. We have a capital accumulation in this world. It is tremendous. And if we don't deal with the problems of international finance, we won't solve the problems of this world. So this is what I want to tell you. Because the problems of the governments are bound with the problems of finance. This means the governments in Europe have become more indebted with the Greek crisis. And they are losing power. They don't have power to act. And our democracy, that is a failing system, is in really bad shape due to that. Because we are not governing anymore. We are tackling from crisis to the next crisis. And I completely understand what Chandra Nair is saying, that they won't count on our help to develop themselves. Neither China was counting on our help to develop themselves. They found a third path and a third way to do it. I would like to hear your comments on that, because I think that at the Club of Rome, we must deal more and more also with the financial aspects of it all.
They were the first ones. Okay, so
Okay.
yes.
I'll look for you.
Sorry.
No,
Yeah.
go ahead. She's, yeah.
Okay. Well, so thank you very much. And I do agree that narratives are important, but I do think that climate change mitigation is actually giving us the opportunity to reinvent those narratives. And in particular, I'm thinking about the renewables revolution in Africa, which is allowing households that are not connected to the electric grid to actually install solar panels and already have electricity. And so in that sense, I think that perhaps the future is actually one of more democratization of the electricity market, more decentralization. And so I think, well, the electric grid itself is a legacy of historical development sort of patterns. And so I think in that sense, we're actually, if we want to mitigate this problem, we're looking to a more democratic future. Last but not least, just last week, the European Parliament, or actually perhaps even this week, legislated on the single use of plastics. So coming back to your example, I think it's not completely a lost cause. And just a very final comment from my side, because, so I was born before 1989, behind the Iron Curtain, and not in just any place behind the Iron Curtain, but in Romania, a country which is known for a quite specific style of dictatorship, often compared to non-European dictatorships, such as, let's say, North Korea. And so I think that actually it is not guaranteed that a strong state with draconic laws necessarily ensures equity or access to resources for people. And so some of the statements made have made me feel particularly uneasy about that. And so I think if we try to separate between some authoritarian regimes being European and others not, I think we're overlooking the fact that fundamentally we're all human beings. And I think it is not necessarily just a European problem. So I think if we want to mitigate climate change policy, we will need liberal values. And if anything, we will need more democracy. So thank you very much.
Okay.
Sorry for my butting in there. I'm a strategist, so I believe if one wants to see the territory and understand it better, one needs to go orthogonally. One needs to go to a high point. I don't believe we really have any true democracies. I don't believe that the governments that believe they are in control are actually in control. I believe what we have is a global monetocracy. The woman who talked about the Greece situation was on it. When Greece stood up to the banking industry, shall we say, the international cartel of banks, they were beaten down. More debt was imposed upon them. We have to recognize that, okay, I call myself a professor without borders. The thesis I teach internationally is that money is a meme. It's a virus of the mind that owns us. It reproduces itself across humanity. Once we realize that, we have an opening to maybe change it. And I came up recently in discussions with the Speaker of the Malaysian Parliament. with a solution. He said, that's a good idea. Now, I suggested it to him as something that the government could mandate, but it could be done individually. And I want to point out that the problem was put in place by J.P. Morgan's neoliberal coup staged at the University of Chicago Business School when he installed a neoclassical economist as the director of the department, and that was soon propagated throughout the educational system. What I'm saying is we should establish that all business majors, and perhaps beyond, all engineers, all chemical engineers, should be required to take ethics and ecology. And that could be done by professors going into presidents' offices.
Okay, so we need to give the panel a chance to respond to some of that.
Perhaps I could just take a few minutes to answer some of the things that were said. I think on the China issue, I mean, China is extremely aware of the whole issue of feeding its population, particularly because it's now dependent, as you said, on that. I would argue China is not a colonial power. I know it's a fear of the West, but in a cheeky way, I'd say Europeans plundered Africa for 500 years, and now you want to blame the Chinese. They've been there about 20, 30 years, let's see. But our job is to make sure China doesn't become a colonizing power. China is not going with germs, missionaries, and guns. The missionary is important. Okay, but the other point is to the young lady who talked about democracy, and I'm used to this in Europe. Someone stands up, says democracy, and then they get the biggest round of applause, and that's important. But nowhere did I say dictatorship. Did I? Nowhere did I say authoritarian state. So this is the narrative that is so fixated in your experience that you immediately equate a strong state. I would say today the United States is a weak state because it's got a very authoritarian figure. I would say that. So, and I don't want to pitch my book, but that's what my new book is about. I don't have time to get into it, but please don't conflate these things. They are very different. I also want to just mention, terminology is important. And in the sort of do-good world, without being too dismissive of all of our efforts, we like slogans. Inclusive growth. It's a load of bullshit. There's no such thing. We live in a world of exclusivity. Of course, we all want to go to nice conferences and hug each other and all of that. But regeneration is also important. But frankly, poor people have got nothing to regenerate. And if they are going to regenerate, I agree the systems that you talked about, guess who they need? The power of the state. In India, Narendra Modi, who's not the most popular, is the only one who's able to trying to fix the rivers. NGOs are not going to do this. Communities are not going to do this. Democracy is not going to do this. It's going to be someone who is able to marshal the institutions of the state to absolutely drive this. And guess what he's running into? Problems. Party system and democracy. China, and I just want to talk about toilets. So if you've been to India, you'll know it's a friggin' mess, right? But my God, Indians have such an ability to build temples. So in fact, I was the one who coined the phrase about 10 years ago, which even the president used, toilets before temples. Screw the temples. In the holy city, I'm going to say this. Screw the temples. Toilets. He has tried to do this, and he has been fought tooth and nail by other vested powers. So it's very important. I'm not talking about, I'm agnostic to the terms you use, whether it's democratic or not. I'm just saying an effective, strong state. And when we talk about the financial system essentially having usurped the state in democracies, what is that? Weak states. They've been usurped by the state. In democratic systems, the financial institutions have usurped this. I don't want to use the cliche, but what is Wall Street? It's usurped the state. And that's the point I'm trying to make here. I'm agnostic to what brand you want to call it. But please don't jump to conclusions that I'm not talking about authoritarian states. But do remember that most of the economies in Asia that grew and became strong were led by very strong figures who put in rules and rules that essentially had a vision. Lee Kuan Yew and people like Korea, Japan, all of these had very strong rules, and so that's kind of where I want to leave this, because I probably said enough about all of these things. But an eco-civilization and recycling and circular economy, they don't happen because NGOs do this. They happen because the state is able to organize on a large scale. But if you live in a small country like Luxembourg, maybe you have a chance. Good luck. But who cares? But I'm sorry, you know, even the nice Nordic people, we love them, but it's like 6 people live there. You know? But if you're talking about real big countries, there's hundreds of millions of people. This is not going to happen by magic and NGOs and we all love each other. It's going to happen by mobilizing the power of the institutions of the state. And if it doesn't, then good luck. Have a picnic, smoke some marijuana, and climate change will arrive. Thank you.
So we started.
And have some yoga too. Yeah.
Thank you, Chandra. We started talking about double binds, and one of the natures of a double bind is when things are perceived in binaries, which is, of course, the opposite of being able to perceive complexity, to be able to perceive contextual information. So I think that's something that needs to be kind of pulled into this, is that when there's a shift in perception, and I'm hoping that everybody in this room just sort of experienced one, when Chandran said, yeah, just because I'm not talking about democracy doesn't mean I'm talking about dictatorship. And immediately you can see that we are patterned into a kind of binary there. And that's a binary that's important to get beyond. There are a number of them floating around right now, and it's part and parcel of the tradition of conferences and of the books we write, of trending vocabulary and ideas, of becoming accustomed to particular sets of possibilities. And in the moment we're in now, new possibilities need to become perceivable. That means that some of the frameworks around the old ones need to crumble off. In the beginning of this session today, we had 3 people who were basically speaking to the idea that a system that cannot learn or adapt collapses. Okay, this is the same process. What is our system, which is not only us as individuals, but our contextual collective cognition and vocabulary and sharing of notions and activities? What is possible there? Can we learn? Can we behave in new ways? Where does that come from? To get out of a double bind, what do you need? You don't need reductionism. You need more complexity. When you have a complex problem, the answer is not simple answers. It's more complex. It's a kind of a confusing, anti-intuitive, counterintuitive process. But I want to be very clear that the opposite of complexity is not simplicity. It's reductionism. Yeah. Simplicity is very complex. So when we're saying we want simple responses, be careful that you really mean simple with the complexity intact and not reductionism. So anyway, I just want to respond. Could I? Okay, Anders and
well, there are so many things to respond to, so I don't know where to start, but I'll be brief. First of all, I think we have to prune the language. And I agree with you that what I heard from Chandran was, we cannot depend on your Western democratic values and your definition of rights and your concept of freedom, etc. And to me, that means that we are throwing out some of the most important elements in our society. We are debating in Europe right now what's happening in some of our member states when the rule of law is being questioned. You have political appointees on the courts. And it's not dictatorship yet, but it's an authoritarian rule. And I would submit that China is a very authoritarian role. So I sort of, maybe we need yet another word to describe this and to come out of this double bind. I agree also with you that this debate is very uncomfortable in this part of the world. And we alluded to the other day another little booklet by Piketty. The 3 million most wealthy Americans, they have a carbon footprint on average of 318 tons per year. And we need to move everybody down to no more than 1.5 or 2 to stay within 2 degrees, not to speak about 1. And to even discuss that in the US, would I agree with you, would probably be impossible, because you will be looked upon as an old-time Marxist. But of course it's a problem, and you cannot solve it simply by carbon quota or emission rights, because those who have a lot of wealth, they will continue to emit 380. So this is, I agree with you, it's a huge problem. The financial sector, I agree very much, Rosario. I think it was one of the most stupid things that happened in the 1980s and early 1990s, to deregulate and liberalize financial markets the way that happened. The assumption being that it would accelerate growth and create more jobs. But we know that a very tiny percentage of all the money that is running around the globe is really related to the real economy. It's related to asset speculation. And debts are building up, and that will of course sooner or later lead to a new financial crisis. And in Come On, we have a number of suggestions what to do to rein in the financial sector. Absolutely. Chandran, you said regenerative development is good, but the poor have nothing to regenerate. Well, I have seen, I don't know how many hundreds or thousands of projects in Africa, in India, in other parts of the world, where local communities are helped to strengthen their livelihoods, to build up fertility in the soils, and thereby also increasing resilience. So, sorry, of course, with no assistance, I agree with you, but if we could target cooperation in a better way, I think that could really help. Finally, I agree with you, civil society organizations are seldom implementing huge infrastructure schemes. But if it wasn't for civil society, I can tell you that most governments would sit on their hands and do very little. It's a vibrant civil society that leads to new ideas, that often takes too long time to implement. But don't you think that a strong state is sort of the patent solution to everything? And I agree very much with you that we have a history recently in Europe. So my only conclusion is we have to strengthen our democratic system. We have to make our economy more long-term, and we have to bring about that redistribution of wealth that you don't believe will happen. Thank you.
Tomoyo, please.
Thank you.
Sorry for the delay.
I couldn't have enough time to share my true point that the yin and yang, and the most important thing is to have the knowledge or the compassion to understand just opposite side of the value. We are not living creature. We are not living species. We are living species which are allowed to live. By whom? Some can call that by God. But yes, God. But in Japan, it's not mono-God. We call that gods of nature. 8 million gods. So when I see that sun, thank you, God of sun. The water, thank you, God of water. We are surrounding, and we are allowed to live to have water, air, food, and soil. Without this, we cannot live without this. Then, sustainability, when we call that sustainability, is environment versus business. Dun dun. Like I showed you, men and women, binary, the opposition. Let's graduate that kind of things. Just open our eyes of our system. Our system is going to be broken. The system of cosmos, right? Then sometimes that kind of talk is like a boy's talk. Sorry to say that. Because where do you come from? You come from mother, right? If mother was so unhappy, you couldn't afford education or culture or religion or whatever. Then my point is, right now, as I was almost about to say that business, the rule of business is make money with money. Profitability and the marketability and more money is the rule, the center philosophy of business, right? Then the calls, women, more women need to our organization or to government. Do you remember that? The General Assembly at the UN last time, just a little tiny living creature was attending that. In the arm of the Prime Minister of New Zealand. Do you remember that? It's for, So my point is, when I became a chairperson of Sanyo Electronics, it's 13 years ago, and I was accused, so girlish, so ladylike, the Mother Earth or Gaia type of things. So amateur. But I made a vision, think Gaia, for the company. Then I carried the things, but I don't care. The laundry machine without usage of water. Could you make believe? Not me, but my staff made that possible 13 years ago under the vision, think Gaia for the next generation and restore the beautiful earth in the future. Then what is going to be happened? The Eneloop, that little tiny rechargeable battery, only one battery can be rechargeable 1,000 times at that time, 13 years ago. Right now, more than 2,000 times the rechargeable, so we can get rid of the soil damage or things like that. Then, more than 12 products, we made it, but Sanyo was now no Sanyo. Why? Because people from New York, especially, some kind of named the street. Wall Street came into our, with money, carrying money, make money, more profit. Then they don't care about the future or lives of kids, whatever. Then they cut into pieces and to sell them. But I'm all right. I got used to be accused or damaged through yellow journalism. But I'm not going to say that. But something has happened. I don't care about the ladies, usually. Don't care about title, money, or bonus. Sometimes, yes, but the wage. But my treasure is my daughter, my family's life. Sometimes the monetary people doesn't care about that. No. So I was scared. Then I quit. Then I made the Gaia Initiative, nonprofit organization, though. But anyway, my point is, we need to come back that real thing of the rule of the cosmos, universe, sustain in. We are not. It's not a matter of matrix or the indication or the model. Without oil, we can survive. It's not a naive thing, but without water, we cannot survive. Then all the wisdom is in Africa or in Asia, and as you mentioned, Eastern culture, Eastern religion is having that fringe to understand to communicate with nature, especially my last comment, is the most important thing is usually cannot be seen and not tangible at all. But we being women is having the communication with the universe. Without moon, we cannot have birth. Monthly month is moon. And all the coal, they don't have Apple Watch at all. But the moon said, it's time for making next generation type of things. So go back to the rule is our mission. So usually the Yogan said that we need education for women. Yes, that's true. But the real thing, real need educate guys. Please learn the real thing and our real system of lives. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, I think the first one was back there somewhere. I'm sorry, I can't track who's got their hands up first, so we'll just...
Yeah, I'm Jeff Lippman. I'm a member of the Club of Rome. I run a small foundation as a legacy to Maurice Strong, who was at the start of all this thinking. I wanted to make two comments, one of which I wanted to make yesterday. And in so doing, I want to align myself with Chandra's vision of where our future is. The first thing is, it was said yesterday that the United Nations is not fit for purpose for dealing with climate change. And I think that is not correct, and I think at this body it needs to be put in place. If we had not had the United Nations, we would not have had the 1972 Stockholm event, we would not have had the Brundtland Commission, we would not have had Rio, and the Millennium Goals and the Sustainable Development Goals, and the Paris Agreement. We would not have had the UNFCCC and all of the IPCC. So I think we should put that into perspective. And the second thing is, we brush over lightly the danger to our world of what I will call Trumpism. Because for the point that Chandra made, it's the state which has so much of the levers of power. And yesterday, much was made of the initiative of Jerry Brown and the private sector, and this is all good stuff. But Donald Trump in 1 year can destroy it all. And we should be realistic about these kind of things. Thank you.
Yeah, in the back. You? Yeah.
Me. I'm sorry.
And then Kadu afterwards. Hold on, do we have a microphone? No. Just use the microphone.
No, the mic's with that lady.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
Sorry, she's had her hand up for a long time.
Basically, thank you very much, everyone, for all your input, for all the statistics, for all the collaboration, and for allowing people like myself, a private researcher, coming from a background of education, very concerned about the world like you all are. And really, I think it's come to the point of going to human nature and the meaning and purpose of us as individuals that we all need, which is beyond economics, which is beyond politics, which is beyond banking, and it is to do really with having emotions that are positive, that are life forwarding in perception, and that equalize everyone around us equally as much as ourselves. Mm-hmm. And there are solutions that I've come across with my studies, and they're not perfect, but they are towards the right way. And unfortunately, they do deal very, very directly with the financial pyramid that has been constructed, not just in the last 200 years or 300 years, but regrettably much, much earlier on. And it's very difficult to eradicate that. So I'm just asking if people have heard of the Ubuntu movement, and I'm not saying that I know much more than you do yourselves, but it actually offers solutions where money is not being used. And a lot of mayors in many different countries are now taking it up. It's so beautiful and still imperfect. And the person behind it is called Michael Tillinger, Tillinger. So I'm just asking, have you heard about that? Because we really need to move away from historic separation things, and we need to also try, if we really want to transform, to go really, really well beyond what is being discussed so far in the financial pyramid sector and many other administrative pyramidal systems.
Yeah,
And so,
exactly. Yeah.
I just wanted to see if anyone knew about this positive solution that's already there.
Thank you. Kadu? Oh, okay. This young woman, and then we're going to do one in the back and there. Okay. Just, can everybody please try to keep it, can we keep it? He was the very first to be fair. Let's let him speak. But keep it really short, and then you'll have your turn, I promise. So try to keep it much shorter, because we're already past. Thank you.
My name is Claudius Ganschik. I've been educating teachers of philosophy and physics for 20 years. I would like to refer to the sentence, to the wisdom. Belief is more important than reality. And belief shaped history, the religions, the old Enlightenment. Now you are demanding a new enlightenment. It will only go if there is a strong belief, with a strong trust, and with feelings, and with enthusiasm and compassion. I think rationality is not enough. I think that is a message of come on. We have to induce feelings, enthusiasm. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. This young lady that's had the microphone twice taken from her. Just so you know, it's impossible to be up here and do this fairly. Go ahead.
Mi scuso se faccio un intervento in italiano, ma non ho preparato.
I don't know if we have a translation process, and we need to.
I don't think people don't have their earphones.
I don't think anybody in the room has earphones. Yeah. Maybe keep it for the afternoon. Can you speak English?
Yes, but I can do it.
Can someone translate for her?
To Chandra.
She can do it.
Okay.
I can hear.
Okay, to Chandra. Maybe one global phenomenon is environmental conflict and human rights violation connected. Because in Europe too we have environmental conflicts. In Italy too, in this moment, we are discussing from a big pipeline from Azerbaijan to Italy to make a different solution to start it to do independent from Russia, but it isn't true. So in the south of Italy, for example, we have a drastic tragedy situation with militarization, criminalization of citizens, and with many problems like safety of the big building that they do here. We have ecco, grazie.
No, she's okay. Her English is good.
Okay.
Yes.
I speak Spanish, but not very well English. So we have to get together a very strong solution, because freedom of press is important. I'm a journalist. I'm a freelance journalist, And to write about this pipeline, I have had many problems, a lot of problems. And this is maybe the one thing that environmental conflict is just the one thing that unify all the world, because indigenous people live the same things. And in Europe we have, so we don't have a lot of differences. Okay.
Thank you so much, yeah. Good job. Kadu has been waiting, and then Ian, and then Sandrine. And then we're going to have to stop until after lunch, and then we have more. Kadu, go ahead, keep it short, pretty please.
Okay. No, thank you. I just really wanted to build a context around that discussion about China, the discussion about decisions being made on regeneration, the examples of the work of NGOs and their role. I've been working on conservation issues in Africa for more than 20 years. Right from the grassroots level with NGOs, with governments. Right now I spend a lot of time with African leaders discussing these issues. I just want to build a context in terms of the decisions people go through to make what China is doing. For example, in Africa, I've heard about China is decolonizing, but the decisions around invitations of China in Africa is so much tied in the financial system we have today. We cannot run away from that. I'll give you an example. The Congo Basin, where I work, is the second lung for the entire world. It's composed of about 11 countries in Central Africa. I've been interacting with their leaders. There is no president in those countries or community leader who makes a decision to invite China to put a mining company in a very prestigious ecological system because they don't want the ecological system. The reason is that they are not rewarded for keeping and maintaining an ecological system we need for climate change. Governments are rewarded when they mine these areas, when they extract oil from these areas. A system that rewards people who can conserve the systems we want for climate change are going to help us retain these systems.
Thank you.
The energy, you talked about energy. NGOs are going to solve these problems. Democracy, we all want to be democratic. We want all the systems. I can tell you, and I don't want to talk about pro or against, but I can assure you, in a country where I come from in Uganda, there is no political leader from a country near a protected area can be voted in office if they promise to improve protection of that area. They have promised. They are voted in office when they promise to degazette the area for agriculture. Degazette. The people are voted into office when they promise to put agriculture in a pristine area. When they are promised that we are going to bring a road through a wetland. So it's not a problem of democracy, but the problem of rewards. So that is the reality in terms of decision and incentives, and it's all tied on the global financial system. There are no bad guys here.
Thank you. Ian Dunlop, and then with the red, and then our new co-president, and then we'll have a quick word from the panel, and we'll break for lunch. We're so late.
Thank you, Chair. Could I just say the one thing that's absent from this discussion is the context in which we're having to do this. If you take everything we talked about yesterday and you accept the argument that we now face an existential risk and the need to move to an emergency response to handle it, then you are talking about something like a war footing. And in wartime situations, all bets are off. Democracy isn't working in the speed of change. The UN is not working. I didn't say yesterday I didn't want it. It has to be reframed. We don't want dictatorship. We don't want authoritarianism. We don't want fascism. So the challenge for the Club of Rome, it seems to me, is to actually say, well, what is it that could actually work? And how do we reframe all the good ideas that have been talked about in terms of new economic systems and so on, to actually move so that we beat and prove Jürgen Randers to be wrong, that we don't hit 2.5 degrees by 2052. And that's really the challenge we've got. So unless you change the context and recognize that it's now acceptance that what was impossible now has to be made possible, that's really the way you've got to look at it.
Exactly. And I think that ties in nicely, too, to what Tomoyo was saying, which is basically, well, we have to be alive to be able to contemplate these issues. It's kind of fundamental. Yes, Sandrine.
So the name of this session was Values for the Anthropocene and a Quest for a New Enlightenment, and I think Ian has touched on one of the conflicting tensions that I have as well with the way in which this conversation has gone. And I heard that this morning, and I think myself and Mampela actually missed an opening remark from Wouter. I don't know if Wouter is still here, and there was a remark about Me Too, whether it was a reflection of gender or whether it was a reflection of the word me. And so I would just like to reflect on that, because I feel like this conversation kind of went in that direction, some aspects of it. Don't forget our way, or don't forget our path, or I think we cannot talk in absolutes in every civilization, in every culture, in every spirituality. And although, Chandra, I fully agree with you that the Western perspective dominates in the West, and we need to totally shift the way in which we think, I think there are many things that need to be shifted also in the Asian region, the Latin American region, etc. And one thing in particular, the red thread, that I really think we need to delve into as we go into one of our core groups, which is going to build on exactly what this panel has talked about, civilization, and I'd like to ask you to just have a quick reflection, is the word corruption. Corruption. Corruption, hate, greed, because that bypasses everything. We have corruption everywhere. We have corrupt leaders everywhere. We've just heard about Greece. I'm sorry the number of times that the Greeks complain about the European Union and the way it handled the financial crisis. I fully agree. There were some huge cock-ups. But let's not forget that the Greeks have not paid taxes for I don't know how many years. That they did not have the right social system in place to be able to actually create the right financial system to be able to pay into the system. Even if the system at the end of the day, the European Union, was also wrong. So I think, again, we cannot talk in absolutes. And if we have dysfunctional systems in the first place, let's fix that dysfunctionality, which often deals with greed and comes back to the original value. And let's see how we, within the Club of Rome, with all of you, can come up with the vision of the future based on that. And that's learning a lot more about what we all need to create together, which comes back to the question of Me Too. I'd like this theme to be called We All.
Thank you, Sandrine. And Ernst, you haven't had a chance to make any reflections, so let's hear from Ernst and then we go to lunch. That's it.
I did have a chance, but I said I prefer the others first to speak. But I wanted to make one point regarding strong state. I fully agree that we need a strong state. But the danger in our days is that people mix that up with nationalism. And nationalism is the opposite of what you want. Europe bashing doesn't help us at all. Europe is the model for the world that nations flourished by surrendering much of their sovereignty rights to a larger entity. But the Anthropocene is not restricted to Italy or to Europe, it's world. So we need a civilization allowing for surrendering more sovereignty rights to the United Nations, if you wish. And this is something then answering Aurelio Peccei's quest for the predicament of humankind.
We don't want to set you free. Anders and Chandran both want to say something. Is that okay? Yes. Okay. So Anders and then Chandran.
Well, thank you very much. I don't know if Thomas Björkman is here or if he has left. Because I think one of the most important things to realize is that whatever we do in terms of strategies, op-eds, meetings, etc. What we really need to do is to talk to ordinary people and help raise awareness and consciousness. Transformation will not happen from the top, because most often transformation from the top is never really working. So, and I don't think, even with today's internet, that we have the right tools in place to really help people. And we need people to see these problems, and Ian alluded to them. And Thomas Björkman wrote a book together with Lene Andersen, another member of the Club of Rome, called The Nordic Secret, which explains how Scandinavia, 150 years ago, how democracy and modernization of society took place. And it was not only a question of school education, it was really a question about meeting with people in the villages. And I think we have to spend much more time on this issue about how do we transform. It's not something about technologies and political decisions, it's about having people understand. Finally, one of the most important persons I met in my life was Alice Miller, a Swiss psychologist. I met her in the 1980s when I was working with the Red Cross, and we were involved in peace education. And she gave a talk, and we were in Russia, and I can tell you, we were in Soviet Union. It was not easy, because we were almost thrown out of the country. And she made the point that there is a Hitler in all of us, and pointed to her book about Hitler's education. And I would just like to remind us, and this goes very much to what you said, I mean, don't categorize things too easily. There are good things in Europe, there are bad things. There are good things in India, there are bad things. We have to be more nuanced in this, and it's not a white-black issue.
Thank you, Anders. Chandran, very short.
Yeah, this is also kind of typical. Now, most of you are thinking, I hate Europeans, I hate white people. This is not what it is, right? Yeah, no, it's not about what. But this is the misconception, because you're not used to people like me. So then you jump, you make leaps, you jump to conclusions and think, this guy's angry, and he doesn't like us, he's against us. I spent 10 years in Europe. I love Europe. I think there's so much in Europe that should teach the world. I agree with what you said about the European Union. It's a model. The only thing I'm saying is, and I think, Anders, you reflected on that when you said, what I'm saying you assumed was, I'm asking you to give up the things that you believe in. No, I'm not. Please stick with it. Just don't export the damn thing. That's all I'm saying. Just don't export it, because exporting it is the height of arrogance. You want to listen to people? Well, listen up. Don't think you have the answers. You want to talk to communities? Well, don't be patronizing and think you have the answers. But I know you can't help it. It's a colonial history. It takes time. It takes time. Europe, I believe, will be part of that extremely new world. For a while, until recently, you followed the United States. Hate Iranians, let's sanction them. Now you understand, Iran is a civilization. Why should they listen to you guys? Why? Because you don't like them? So my point is, don't export. Other civilizations have different political systems. They have to work it through. And they don't need your foreign aid to come and help them with a bit of, rural activity. They have to fix this with a political economy, and they have to build their institutions. You can't build it for them. You can. Thank you.
So after lunch, we're going to be talking about the SDGs, which is, I think, a perfect continuation of this conversation. Please enjoy your meal and come back within 45 minutes because we cut in. And we have piano. What time is the piano starting?
Oh. We have Elisabeth Sombart playing at 1:45 again. Please be back then.
Can we follow up at some point? Because we don't think you're angry. I like your comments.
The circular economy in China is driven by the state.
I know, but we work with them.
Yeah, it's not driven by NGOs. I love them, but they don't run.